Mrs. Pittman, you are a very familiar face in this community, and folks who know you will know that you were Irving's first female council member.
That is correct.
And the stories that you can tell just from that part of your life forward are great history of Irving and fascinating. But here's what I found out about you. The stories that came before are even more fascinating.
Well, you're kind to say that, that's for sure. Well, let's say probably the stories that came before had a lot to do with why I thought I was brave enough and good enough to run for the council.
I think you're right. When we talk about the things that happened in your past, they really sort of laid the foundation for your point of view on the world and what I see as a tremendous sense of right and wrong, and sort of propels you to get out there and
Yeah. Well, my daddy was very strong on right and wrong. Got in trouble, real big trouble, for mispronouncing the fish crappie one time.
uh-oh.
And so I learned real young that there was right and wrong. But in a large extent, I was my daddy's second boy. So whatever my brother did, who was 5 years older than me, Joyce did too. And so there were no limits on what kind of work I did, what kind of chores I did. I milked the cow, I drove the plow behind the horse, I learned to drive on a tractor. So I had a real country, whatever had to be done, you're going to do it upbringing. I mean, that's where I was.
Well, it's when I look at you, because you are a tiny person, I can't imagine you driving a tractor, but I know that you did because you told me about some of the things that were required of you,
Yeah.
even as a little girl. So you grew up on a farm
I did.
in a community that no longer exists. Can you talk about that?
Yes, it was a little community called Riley, Ryle, in southeast Dallas County, close to Kleberg, Sigaville, Kaufman, down in that part of the world. No longer exists, but we had a little independent school there when I was growing up, and I graduated from Riley High School, which was kind of interesting. Everybody says who, what, they think it's Wiley with the W, but it wasn't.
I think that it's kind of telling about your personality too. When you left high school, you were already a young married woman.
I was.
Would you mind talking about that?
Well, that was a big secret to the school, of course. In those days, if you were a married woman, you did not finish school. You were out, you were person non grata, whatever. I mean, you couldn't go there as a married woman. But I had married young. My husband's family actually introduced my husband and me. Growing up on a farm, my dad raised okra, and we provided over 50 acres of okra that we had to harvest half of it one day and half of it the next to provide all the okra for the A&P stores that were in this part of the world at that time, and with okra for the summer. And that was a lot of okra.
How many stores are we talking about? Because you're saying AP regionally, you don't just mean...
No, I don't mean stores, period. I mean a 5-state region.
Wow.
I mean, we did Texas, Oklahoma, Arkansas, New Mexico, in Louisiana. And so that was a lot of okra, folks.
Yeah. That's a bunch of okra. But that was your...
That was our main crop. That was our cash crop. We sold what we call number one, the small stuff, to the A&P stores. And the larger stuff that was still tender and made the best frying okra, actually, we sold at the Dallas Farmers Market. And that is where I met my husband's folks and where he and I met. So we met on the day after his 18th birthday in 1958. And we're married, let's see, June, July, August, September, October, 4 months later.
Okie dokie.
So to stop and count it up.
Whirlwind courtship, and it
it
has
was.
lasted to this day.
It has, and we're looking at 56 years this year, so.
And that's an incredible accomplishment. It really is. I mean, this day and age, if people
Yeah.
marry and stay married 15 years, they think, "Whoa, we've got this beat now."
Well, actually, I'm not sure if it was just a good match a good marriage or stubbornness, but probably some of all of that went into play.
Well, I wanted you to bring that up because it sounds like, oh my gosh, she married so young. But I think that this next story that I'm going to ask you about will show just how much steel there is in that spine of yours. You mentioned that that crop was your cash crop.
That's right.
That was the way that the family ate and kept the lights on and did everything that was necessary to sustain the family down there in Riley, Texas. And one year your dad was sick.
Right.
Would you mind telling that story?
He got sick in the spring, right after early in March or April, and he had planted the crop, but it had not yet been, hadn't grown out of the ground yet. I mean, the seeds were still in the ground. And once you plant it, you still have to go in and till it and do all the other things. You have to plow, and that's a lot of the stuff I did behind the horse because you couldn't get the tractor down the row, or we had a tractor that wouldn't fit one or the other. But we did that, and then you had to go through with the hoe and make sure it wasn't too thick or it wouldn't grow and make nice plants. So all of that had to be done, the preparation. And that takes a couple of months or more for it to get ready to harvest. We usually started harvesting in May, and Dad had to go to the hospital. He got adult onset rheumatic fever, and he was in a coma for over 2 months. And my mom had just started driving, was a very inexperienced driver. And my brother had gotten married and moved on to another farm in South Texas. And so I was at home with an 8-year-old sister to take care of the farm, which I did.
And it was just you, and
It was just me.
15, 16?
I was 16, turned 16 that year. And, you know, I hired the hands, I made the crop, I sold the crop, I negotiated with the buyers on what they were going to pay me.
I love that story about how you negotiated with the folks at A&P. Could you tell that?
Sure. My dad had had a longtime competitor who had been trying to get involved in the business with a contract with A&P. And that gentleman was positive that with Dad sick, he could take over that business and get that contract. It was a very lucrative contract. And it made a person who was in the farming business with okra like we were able to make their year secure. And farmers some people may not know, is the fact that there is usually one main cash crop, and anything else is to kind of fill in the pieces. And so okra was our main cash crop. That's what made our year, and the rest of it, the radishes and the onions and all the other stuff, that was just sort of to tide us over until we got to the cash crop.
And you could take it to farmer's market,
Exactly,
et cetera. Okay.
exactly. So I went in and talked to the man and said, you know, Mr. Norman, I'm going to do this for Dad. And quite frankly, I wasn't totally truthful with him. I didn't tell him how sick he was. So, and I said, you know, you really need to get by the hospital and talk to him. And which he never did, thank goodness, because Dad was in a coma for 2 months. But he did decide to go ahead and take a risk on me, because Dad had always been good to his word, and he had never had to worry about getting the okra he needed to fill all the different stores in that 5-state area.
Wow.
So he did, and knowing that I was going to have competition, I went to another gentleman who I know raised okra and told him that if I needed extra okra, could I buy it from him? And he agreed. And I said, you know, whatever it is, whatever I'm paid, I won't make profit out of what I buy from you. I'll pay you what I'm paid, but I'll make the profit out of my own crop. And so he kind of looked at me and scratched his head, and he said, well, I love and trust Mr. OB, so, you know, I'll do that. So I was able then to go in, and when it got dry and hot and it was hard to find enough okra to fill the orders, I went into the buyer at A&P and I said, Mr. Norman, you know, we're going to have, you know, 3 or 4 or 5 more cents a pound, whatever it was. I can't remember now. But I actually negotiated, and the man's mouth fell open. But he did it because he knew that if he went anywhere else, he'd have to pay that or more. And so I was able to do that and make a cash crop. And one of the things that I was really proud of is that at the end of that summer, my dad had not been able to work the whole summer. He did finally come home and actually receive some experimental medicine that brought him out of the coma. The doctor said, you know, you either try this or he's gone. I mean, and Mother was afraid to do it, but she was afraid not to do it. So he did get that medication. And, but he couldn't work that whole summer. It was too hot. I mean, he was in the house, air conditioning, which is the first time we'd ever had air conditioning in our house. We had to do that for Dad because he couldn't come home as sick as he was and be in the heat. And so at the end of the year, we had our bills paid off from the winter. We'd paid the hospital bills. He was free and clear at the hospital, and we had some money in the bank to go into the winter.
And
I
you
thought
made that happen.
that was pretty good.
You made that happen.
I did.
And that's extraordinary. So obviously we're not talking about some teenage girl with stars in her eyes getting married. You're a grown woman. You know what.
Yeah, I had done all that 2 years before I met my hubby. So, you know, I carried the responsibilities of an adult and really didn't think anything about it. I mean, that's just what had to be done. And that's what happens when you're raised on a farm. You do what you have to do.
Well, you know, I have to say that I think of it as extraordinary because that's a lot of burden to take on. Of course you were worried about your father.
Oh, yeah.
You know, and you've also got your 8-year-old sister that you're also looking after all of this work is done on the day. It's an extraordinary thing that you did. So
Well,
if you want to pat yourself on the back a little bit, I think you should.
Well, you know, I didn't until later, until I realized, you know, you do what you have to do in a crisis. And it's not until later that you realize, well, that was pretty good, you know. But, and I have to be honest, I packed my sister off to my granny's, so I couldn't deal with the 8-year-old farm and everything else.
Exactly, and you know, negotiating these contracts and things. So after you and your husband married, and I'm not remembering quite the chronology here, but I know that something took you guys to I'm going to mess up the city.
Well, first he went to New Haven, Connecticut. He joined the Air Force, and it was a tough year for jobs, as it is. You know, there's always cycles, and for a high school graduate, it was a tough year. And so he decided, well, the military is probably a good thing to do, and so he went to basic training in San Antonio, and then went to New Haven, Connecticut, to Yale, and was trained to be a Chinese linguist. And after that, he was sent to San Angelo, Texas, where he had security training before he went overseas.
And this is the Korean War, just to give...
no, it was after the Korean War.
Okay.
It was between Korea and Vietnam.
Okay, and so at that point, you guys were we as a country needed to know what was going on in that part of the world.
We did.
And so someone needed to learn how to speak Chinese,
Exactly.
and your husband was
Exactly.
one of them.
He flew and listened to the conversations out of the airplanes out of Korea and China to see what was going on. So of course, I didn't know that for many, many years. We didn't know because he couldn't tell anybody what he was doing. But I knew he was stationed in South Korea, so.
So when you guys were in San Angelo, one of the things that you did to help support the family was working at a newspaper. And this is another story that I love about who you are as a person. So can you talk about that period of your life?
Be glad to. That was fun. I had 2 full-time jobs. Now that made his 2 years overseas go by in a hurry. But my nighttime job was as a proofreader at the San Angelo Standard-Times. And those were the days, folks, when it was before computers. We had a big teletype machine that fed us on the yellow paper that was about this long, big rolls that came in the information about things that were going on. And it would have the who, what, when, where, and why. And those bits of information would go upstairs to the editors and various writers, and we'd get the stories back, which I proofread, and I'd get the yellow paper back with the stories. And after reading, let's see, here's where it happened, and here's who it was, and this is sort of why. And then I'd read 2 pages of stuff over here that the editor had written on what happened. I'm saying, okay, how did that come from here? It all came out of that editor's head. It had nothing to do. He wasn't there. He didn't hear it. He only knows who, what, when, where. And the rest of it, he made up.
Yeah. So what did you think about that?
Well, I was amazed, one, that that much was made up out of that editor or that writer's own perspective of what he wanted to have happened. Whether it happened that way or not, that's the way he or she, in those days, it was he. There were no she writers that I can remember. That it was in the political and personal viewpoints of that particular editor or writer was what was presented as fact. And that was totally astounding to me, especially coming from my daddy's it's truth or it's not truth. And so that got me very interested in politics. And this was the year that President Kennedy was running. And I saw how much was slanted in order to make people think that they were prejudiced against Catholicism and Catholics if they wouldn't vote for President Kennedy.
Ah, I see.
And I thought, that's insane. I mean, I know Catholics. I've worked with Catholics. What's wrong with Catholics? Nothing's wrong with Catholics. But a lot of that perspective was written that way. And that was something else that was just astounding to me. That you can slant something in such a way simply by that person's ideology to make people think they're guilty because they have a difference with something else, not the religion, but the point of view. Yeah.
So this is as you said, a second full-time job. You had another full-time job that you did during the day.
I did. I was worked in an insurance office during the day. So that was my second stint as an insurance office. Those folks always needed needed people because they didn't pay much money, I think.
Yes. You had, if I'm remembering this correctly, worked in insurance when you guys were in New Haven, Connecticut, while your husband was learning to speak Chinese.
I did. I did. And if you remember, or maybe I told you or not, that particular job in Connecticut, I had to go basically street walk and knock on doors to offices to find, because the state city employment office would not send me out on interviews because I was the wife of a military man and I wouldn't be there but a year. I mean, how do you know that any employee is going to be there more than a year?
Yeah.
But anyway, they would not send me out on job interviews. So basically, I knocked doors and found 2 jobs and gave one to my friend, and I took the other one. So
another military wife.
That's
if I
right.
remember correctly.
That's right. And we were the only 2 wives who found a job because we were energetic enough to get out and beat doors. And one reason I did that is, hey, I grew up on a farm. If it has to be done, you do it.
Get out there and do it. So once your husband left the service, you guys ended up in the Dallas area with work, and you met someone in the Corvette Club, and that sort of inadvertently led to your moving to Irving. Would you talk about that?
Exactly. Well, we belonged to we bought a brand new red convertible Corvette. Young kids, we were, Clyde was in college, and I was taking part-time college. I was working, at that time, let me think, who did I work for? Industrial Towel. And he was at TI, and we bought a Corvette and then got acquainted with the Dallas Corvette Club. And I think that was sponsored by Moore Chevrolet at that time, which was fun. They had a big van they let us drive with our group. We had 30, 40 members. And one of the members, who had a white convertible, ours was red, it was prettier. But anyway, he lived in Irving, and he got transferred to Florida, and he had a home out here he was going to sell. So we said, all right, we need a bigger place. We're ready to do something rather than just an apartment. So that's when we moved to Irving. We took over the payments on the house because we were anticipating a brand new baby boy that we had been told we would never have.
So all these years that you've been married, no children. And so
That's right.
you assumed, or I guess the doctors told you.
I was told. I was
that there's
clearly
no way
right.
that you're ever going to be able to have a child.
Exactly.
Wow.
So
Something changed.
yes, probably debt. We got in debt for a house. We had a car. We couldn't afford him then.
Yeah, right, exactly.
But at any rate, that was a blessing. And after that, we were involved in the Irving JCs, and that got us involved in city politics to some degree or another.
You worked on several campaigns, didn't you?
We did. I did actually. Helped get Bob Davis elected as a state representative. I worked on Joe Putnam's city council race, Dan Matkins' race for city council when he was mayor, and one thing led to another, and it seemed really strange to me that all these men that I worked so hard for got so much smarter, that when they went to the city council and went to the state house, suddenly they knew so much more than I did. And I would ask a question and they'd say, well, you don't understand. And at some point I said, well, I'll just run myself and then I'll understand. So maybe that's what happens from being a farm girl and being raised up as your daddy's second boy.
Yeah, and you look at things and you think, okay, so if I don't understand, here's how I'm going to figure it all out.
That's how I'm going to figure it out.
So you ran.
So I ran and was blessed, and I think there were 7 people in that race. I may be wrong. There were 5 or 7. There were 2 of us in the runoff, 2 women. And so I managed to eke out a win, and that was in the days of Maggie Thatcher. So she was elected as prime minister about that time, and I went on the council, and that was significant to me.
That was the breaking of a glass ceiling. You were the
was.
first. There
I
had
was.
never been a woman elected to that kind of a position in Irving at that time, and I'm sure that it was an adjustment for the gentleman on the council,
very
and an
much
adjustment
so.
for you too.
Well, for everybody. Yeah, I joke about they all were angry at me because they could no longer meet at the 19th hole of the country club. And so our next meeting place happened to be for work sessions was at Denny's. So that was quite a come down from Las Colinas Country Club 19th hole to the Denny's.
And you should probably explain the 19th hole was not open to women at that time.
That's true. Well, the 19th hole is adjacent to the men's dressing room for the golfs. So, you can't really have a lady in the 19th hole while the men are getting their showers after they played golf. So
this is really different because nowadays, of course, there's a council chambers and there's a place to have the work session meetings and everything is televised. You guys were still operating under the same kind of open meeting laws and things like that.
Absolutely.
You just had to have a place to actually meet because there wasn't that.
Exactly.
That changed while you were a council person, though.
It did change. We built our city hall. It's still new to me. And I was on that committee to build that city hall. Councilman Raper, who went on to become Mayor Raper, and I sat on that committee, and we were very proud of bringing that construction project in on time and on money or under money, so we didn't have to increase the bonds. I don't know, to go out for more credit to do that building. Jimmy Scoggins was our architect, and he and I sat and picked a lot of the colors and schemes that happened in City Hall, and we built 2 extra floors that were unfinished, so we'd have expansion room.
That was looking forward.
And the wall covering behind the council dais with the family was one of the things that Jimmy and I worked together on to try to make it inclusive of how we were there to represent the people, not there for ourselves. So that
That's
was
a lovely image to think about. I didn't realize that's why that was there, but it certainly makes sense now that
Yeah.
now that I know you. It certainly
yeah.
makes sense that
Well,
that's the thing that you would
that's what I
choose.
we talked about. We're there. We've been voted there to do the people's will, and that's what we're supposed to be there for, and to take care of the people's business. It's not for our own purposes.
It's a nice reminder of what the focus is supposed
Yeah,
to be.
yeah.
Well, as we sort of draw to a close, I wish that I had another 2 hours to talk with you, but you've had a lot of challenges in your life, not the least the health challenges that you've dealt with lately. Yet you sit here smiling, looking wonderful. I happen to know that you're not always free of pain because you shared that with me. When you take a look at the things that you were able to accomplish and still the ability to go forward the way you have, even facing these health challenges, what do you attribute that to? Is it that farm girl raising, do you think?
Well, I think that's a lot of it. I mean, you get a determination. Either you can do it, or you'll find a way to do it, or you can't do it. And we didn't have any choice, but can do. I mean, we had to make the crops. We had to harvest. We had to do these things, and so that's part of it. And heck, I'm 74 this year. I was one of the youngest people ever elected to the city council. Plus, I was also a female, which was, like I say, that was the year that Maggie Thatcher became PM. I think she was the first lady PM. So that was prime minister, maybe I should say, for someone who may not be acquainted with that. But that and the fact that probably to some degree, I was raised abnormally for girls. I mean, I was daddy's second boy. To people in this day and age, you don't realize that in those days, girls maybe did the wash and they stayed home and they did the house, but they didn't work in the field. I did. I mean, I drove the horses, I drove the tractor, I learned to drive on the tractor. One of my first memories is, if you live in the country, you have to dig out the well every so often. It has to be cleaned out to get the water to flow, to get down to the spring. And I was a good size to go down in the well in a bucket.
Oh my God.
And
Seriously?
seriously. That well was not over 20 feet deep, maybe, but that was a long way for a little girl.
Yes.
And
And
so,
terrifying because
exactly,
it's dark.
in dark, and I could see the daylight up there, and that may be one reason I still don't like small places. But I went down in the bucket, and I could use the other bucket and fill it up with mud, and they could hook it up and pull it up.
So that was your job.
That was my job.
Wow.
Because there was no, my brother was too big, and it had to be my daddy's strength to pull us up. So I did it.
So that's what you did. So I guess I'll let this be my last question. If I ask you to name the characteristics that you think have been the most important in your own personality to your public and personal success, what would you say they are?
Determination, probably with a good dose of stupidity. And I think a fair sense of humor, and I have to go back to my daddy. You're supposed to do what's right. And God, it's there.